In the late 18th century into the early 19th century, as medicine tried to claw its way out of the Dark Ages, there was one thing keeping it from unlocking the mysteries of the human body. And that was, well, the human body. You see, if you wanted to be a surgeon in the 19th century, the study of anatomy was absolutely mandatory, but the supply of legal bodies was grossly inadequate. So that meant teachers of anatomy and their students had to rely on the services of a group of men who were reviled and feared. Those men were called the Resurrectionists. Today on History by the Book. In the sunken roads that traversed the neighborhood of the burying ground, the last glimmer failed them. Thus, under the dripping trees and environed by the huge and moving shadows, they reached the scene of their unhallowed labors. Now, while the Resurrectionists sounds like a cool name for an 80s goth band, in the 19th century, the name had quite a different connotation. In the 19th century, resurrectionists were a group of men who were feared and reviled because of their occupation, which was heading down to the church graveyard at night, exhuming some fresh bodies and selling them off to the anatomy schools for dissection. And in the 18th and 19th century, dissection was a fate worse than death. And our rock band and the Resurrectionists do have some things in common. For one, they both performed in groups almost exclusively at night. And they both used instruments. And while the rock band would have used guitar, basses, and drums, the Resurrectionists used shovels, ropes, and burlap sacks. And while fans of our fictitious goth band were dying to get tickets, if you wanted to watch a performance of the 19th century Resurrectionists, well, you had to already be dead. Now, just like in the music world, the resurrection world also had its celebrities, namely these two here. This is William Burke and William Hare. Now, Burke and Hare terrorized 1828 Edinburgh with their murderous activities, killing up to 16 people and selling them off to Robert Knox School of Anatomy. Now, Robert Knox was a perfect accomplice because, one, he paid well, and two, he didn't ask any questions. And later that year, when Burke and Hare were finally caught, Hare turned evidence, sending Burke on a one-way trip to the gallows. And after he was executed, his body was handed over to Alexander Monro, an anatomist. And when Monro was finished dissecting Burke's body down to the bone, his skin was used to bound a cute little notebook that you can still see today at the Hall of Surgeons in Edinburgh. Now, you can't take pictures in the museum, so I popped down to the gift shop and got myself one of these, because who wouldn't want a facsimile of a notebook bound in a murderer's skin as a souvenir? Now, at this point, you may be wondering, well, what does this have to do with literature? Well, some of the best-known novels from the 19th century do feature resurrection in them. For example, you have Charles Dickens' wife-beating Jerry Cruncher from A Tale of Two Cities, whose black eyes had no depth of form or color. And of course, then there's everybody's favorite resurrectionist, Mary Shelley's Victor Frankenstein, whose humanity turned to loathing as he dabbled amongst the unhallowed damps of the grave. But my favorite is a short story by Robert Louis Stevenson simply called The Body Snatcher. Published in 1884, Stevenson's story is centered around two young medical students, Fettis and Wolfe McFarlane, who are assistants for Mr. K in the dissection room. Now, notice I said Mr. K, not Dr. K. And that's because in the 18th and 19th century, physicians and surgeons were two different classes. Physicians were basically gentlemen, and gentlemen didn't work, and physicians rarely would touch the patient. Instead, they evaluated you and then prescribed medication. Where surgeons were considered skilled laborers and part of the working class, so they didn't share the same social status. But regardless, I think we know who Mr. K is. And Burke and Hare also make an appearance in the story. Now, Stevenson doesn't name them, but through Fetis, he tells us that the resurrectionists delivering bodies to Mr. K's anatomy school were unclean and desperate interlopers. Now, when Fetis notices that the bodies are ridiculously fresh and he actually recognizes one of them, Mr. K tells him to ask no questions. Now, the story begins with 4 friends who gather at the parlor of an English inn called the George. And this is several years after Fetis has left medicine behind him. The unknown narrator describes Fetis as an old drunken Scotchman who was often in melancholy in a saturated state of drunkenness. Now, Fetis's friends refer to him as the doctor because they knew he had some kind of special knowledge of medicine, and I bet you can guess what that is. Now, one evening, when the friends are gathered together, a guest at the inn becomes ill, and an esteemed doctor from London is called in to treat him, and it happens to be Wolfe Macfarlane. Now, when Fetis recognizes Macfarlane, he runs up to him and grabs him and says, "Have you seen it again?" And Macfarlane responds by crying out and fleeing the inn. Now, if you want to know what it is, well, there's no spoilers in this video, so you're going to have to read the book for yourself. Now, resurrection didn't just take place in Britain. It was also happening here in the States. And in 1846, 38 years before Stevenson would put pen to paper, a man named John Hovey Robinson, who was a physician, a novelist, and a poet, wrote a book called Marietta, or The Two Students. Now, like Stevenson's short story, Robinson's also focuses on 2 young medical students whose names are Levator and Eugene. But unlike Stevenson's novel, well, Robinson's is more like a warped, bizarre love story with a very predictable ending. And the resurrectionists in Robinson's story are almost comical. They're named Gaunt and Mr. Thick, and the descriptions make them sound more like an evil version of Laurel and Hardy. And I'm sure humor wasn't Robinson's intent, but his writing style is nowhere near the level of Stevenson's. But nonetheless, it is an entertaining story, and it is one that's kind of worth checking out. The last book, The Diary of a Resurrectionist, isn't a novel or a short story. It is actually a diary from a real resurrectionist named Joseph Naples. Now, Joseph Naples was part of the notorious Borough Gang, which plundered the London cemeteries between 1811 and 1812. But unlike the resurrectionists in Stevenson's novel or in Dickens, Joseph Naples was actually well liked by the people who knew him, and he was described as a man of having a pleasant countenance and respectable manners. And Naples was also highly educated compared to some of his illiterate colleagues. Now, Naples' diary consists of entries by Naples which document the names of people in the Borough Gang, some of the anatomists that he sold to, and also the numbers of bodies that they would get on a particular night, as well as the money that they were paid for them. And in some instances, Naples writes about intoxication, because let's face it, I'd need a drink or two before I went to the graveyard to harvest bodies at night. Now, it's highly unlikely that Naples meant for his diary to be published, but it is a fascinating insight into the life of a real resurrectionist. Now, the editor, James Blake Bailey, wrote a fantastic introduction that precedes the diary entries, and it is absolutely captivating. Now, if you want to go back and read some of the things that I've mentioned in this video, you can find some of them for free online, and I'll link them down below. And if you like this video, please give it a like and consider subscribing, because there'll be more coming soon. Thanks for joining me on History by the Book. See you next time.